Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to run you through my plus 17 Grim Batol run that we had done recently, going over the boss fights, difficult trash packs, and how best to heal it. First things first, with trash being the most lethal thing in the run, most of our bloodlusts are being used onto trash pulls. We grab the first Overseer patrol and bring it in with a Twilight Destroyer, line of sight his big knockback using some of the pillars on the sides of the room, and blast everything into oblivion. Often I'm kind of going into this pull and trying to make sure that I can get some shields out onto somebody who might get the debuff from the destroyer, line of sight, and then get back in there, send my squid, send my mind blast into a radiance cast, and start pounding damage to start overhealing really through any major cast that might end up getting through. The same thing goes for the following pull that we end up doing. We take a little bit of time killing off the Overseer for cooldowns, and then drag all of these Earth Callers, including the one towards the next hallway where the next dragon is and where the next bombing run is. Grab all these casters in together and making sure that I'm having Barrier down, having my Squid, my Mindbender, my Void Wraith down, so that even if there aren't all these bolts fully going off onto players, you might have one go off here and there. We're alternating between all of our crowd controls to shut down these Earth Callers to make sure their casts are not going off, but some of them still are going to go through, and that's where I'm watching the target a target underneath the target bar on the middle right side of my screen. And usually I have my targeted spells effect from Cell working properly, but I had some issues with it in this run, so the frames are kind of all glowy. After those mobs are dead, we do our bombing run, and we try to leave the Overseer on the bridge and that Earthcaller pack mostly untouched. We're grabbing all of those mobs, dragging it in together, and stepping on one of those eggs at the very edge of the hallway, or I guess it's the corpse of the red dragon, activating the other Twilight Destroyer, and then popping all of our big cooldowns and nuking everything down. First boss in General Umbrus, there's a constant need to have a cooldown rotation going to live the huge damage that's coming out of those shouts. Some of the cooldown rotation is either pre-shielding myself or some of my allies with Rapture shields, making sure that I have some kind of defensive up. Priest has Fade 10%, Protective Light by casting Flash Heal on yourself or somebody else, which also works with Surge procs. It's another 10%. And the 40% health increase out of Desperate Prayer. So we are cycling between those personals and using things like Barrier and Zephyr at different times to start spacing out so somebody always has a cooldown to make sure that they're going to be able to live. Personally, as a priest, I always have Fade, I always have Protective Light, and so usually I'm just kind of adding on a shield of varying strengths to make sure that I'm able to survive. It's important to note that you always have to communicate a lot with your tank on how much they might need pain suppression for some of the huge dots that they're going to be taking. Fortunately, Prop Paladin has an insane amount of cooldowns at their disposal, and we have the Aug Evoker for the Cauterizing Flame to dispel the bleed that the Tank Buster is going to put out. But you might also have some situations where you need to have those pain subs as you need to. What we often did from like a cooldown rotation perspective was I would make sure that I would always have something between like Zephyr, Barrier, even just pre-shielding everybody with Rapture to survive some of those shouts. And then I would have weaker shields at the ready in order to defensive people when they're dropping off some of the earthquakes around the room. That way you can also have a good way of like charging up extra shields by using your 4-set bonus with Smites and Penances, increasing your next shield to better allow you to like prioritize less tanky targets like myself. And there are even moments where you can see how low you drop or how quickly you can drop very low from some of the shout damage or some of the spike damage if you don't have a defensive up. It's really a matter of just sort of mapping out those cooldowns, and we even take advantage of Spatial Paradox for the moments where you have to run from one edge of the room to the other. That ability from the Augmentation Evoker allows you to cast on the move as a healer, allowing you to start slide casting all the way around and make sure that you're going to be in the right position when you need to. If you really want to min-max this fight, try to time your Squid in your Rift, or just your Rift if you don't have your Squid up, for some of the shout damage, because when you have to deal with the line dodges and all the movement that's involved, you can very quickly get into a bad position where everyone's not fully topped off. Then you have to drop off earthquakes, and then somebody could die when they're not full 100% HP. As we go up to Forge Master Throngus, it's very difficult to do a lot of chain pulling with these trash mobs. So when we're fighting any of the molten giants, I'm always making sure I'm keeping an eye on my nameplates, as that has the cooldown. I think it's through Little Wigs, which tracks the cooldown of their major abilities. Holding onto my squid, holding onto my rift with my mind blast, and then popping those before the stomp goes out, so that will quickly be able to top off. Especially when you pug, you can just have these like errant bolt casts going off left and right, and so pushing up health pools as fast as you possibly can is the surefire way to make sure everybody is going to be healthy enough to tank any unexpected hit that might end up happening. And in order to optimize some of our cooldown timings, we do end up pulling trash in with the boss. We have one caster mob, and then the other two mobs that follow the Earthcaller around are just providing these like really annoying frontals. And so what we're doing is we're making sure we have cooldowns up as we pull them into the Forge Master, and it's a bit of an awkward pull as we get into there. We actually have our first death as a result of trying to optimize the frontal from the boss and that positioning to make sure that we have as much room as we can, and the fire is kind of just right on top of us. But that's the only fatality we had throughout this run. I am making sure that each time any like the forge weapons are going out, I at least have my Mind Blast ready to deploy my Entropic Rift. Often you want to make sure you have your Mind Blast and your squid, your Void Wraith, to deploy for the Molten Furies, because those are going to be debuffing players and you can't line of sight them anymore. And so when the flurry goes off, it's going to debuff players kind of like one at a time, where they're going to drop fire pools, and then they're going to have the Forge Mace AoEs that are going to follow. This is a great time as well to make sure you have this huge ramp with both your squid and your rift, but it's also really important to lean on your pain suppressions, barriers, Zephyr, those extra cooldowns, because the extra movement by the entire party as you drop off the fire can really quickly lead to somebody taking an extra tick of fire and then dying as a result. There's also a really huge importance on just watching these timers. I was even late at one point throughout one of the forged weapons, and people had to burn all their health pots to stay alive because I was a little bit later with my cooldown timings than I had actually intended to. We also pulled the next round of Earthcaller and then the double frontal mobs in near the end of the boss fight, and when we have all that AoE going off, I drop barrier, and I'm also looking for Shadow or Death targets so that I can get a little bit more damage and Shadow Covenant extension onto my squid through the Inescapable Torment talent passive, and I'm also just trying to get a little bit of extra healing alongside of it. This is also a really good spot, and I'll have it in the description down below if you wanted to use a cancel aura macro for your rift, since there's not too much damage that really follows a forged weapon. If you're running late, you're running behind, you're in an emergency, you're not able to get as much output, you can cancel aura the rift early, and I do it a little bit near the end of the encounter to cancel that rift, collect that damage, turn it into healing onto your allies, and then make sure that they just survive. Once Throngus dies, we go into a huge pull with the Lava Bender and then mobs on both the left and right sides as you leave Throngus's room with all of our major cooldowns up. This pull in total lasts something like 25 seconds or something along those lines. Focusing down the Lava Bender makes it very, very effortless to be able to kill off all of these mobs, and the Enforcer is the last to die throughout this. Notably, the Enforcer gains more damage onto the tank the more strikes that it completes onto that target, but it's very easy to kite, get away from, and then cause those stacks to reset, while as a Lava Bender, when it hits that 50% mark, it then starts pulsing a lot of AoE damage, making it really, really nasty if you don't end up focusing it down. So that's the priority when we have all of our cooldowns. And when you're pushing at this high key level, you basically are doing a lot of pulls around all of these cooldowns, all these resources. And so after that, we end up having a couple of Warlocks. We have like 3 Warlocks right afterwards, and this pull takes quite a lot longer since we don't have any of these cooldowns up. In this situation, this is where my responsibility is to just make sure that people are going to live long enough for the DPS to dispel any of these curse effects onto the target. The higher level you go, the harder it is for you to just muscle heal through those curse effects. And so using Rapture Shields, or even just the empowered shields that you're getting out of Wheel and Woe from hitting your penance, and the empowerment you're getting from your 4-set bonus to just make your shields larger. The ticking damage of the curses is really not that high, so as long as you have some kind of support for them, they're usually going to end up living long enough. You can even see Kin's dispel doesn't even go off until like the last second, so he's almost on that entire full duration for that curse debuff. Then I'm getting Spatial Paradox, and I'm actually using it to pull the Lava Bender. So Spatial Paradox, while it lets you cast on the move, it also increases the range of your abilities. And so I'm able to start pulling a Lava Bender from a distance, drag it into the rest of the pack, and then we have our big 2-minute cooldowns once more, and this pack gets so much easier to kill off when it's easy to stack everything together and everyone has big cooldowns. We continue to pull the rest of the trash leading up to the third boss in similar fashion, but we also see that we have cooldowns on hand as we reach the third boss fight, which notably has a really slow start. So what we end up doing is we grab all of our cooldowns, put them all together, run around the double lava benders. You can't mind soothe them, we just walk right around them. We pop Lust, we pop all of our cooldowns, and we just burn them down as fast as we possibly can. We're using the pillars again for line of sight against the Destroyer's knockback AoE. You have huge Rapture shields that you can put out onto people, which will help throughout any of the dot damage, because notably people don't want to be dispelling when they have all their cooldowns up. And in the case of like a shaman, if they have AG up, they probably can help you muscle heal through some of these curse effects with your healing and theirs all put together. On Draga, it's very important to keep in mind that you do not want to be using any sort of fears, disorients. There's a couple different effects onto those elementals, because that actually can cause them to retarget with their fixates. So as a result, we're using basically just knockbacks and stuns to keep these elementals off of our party so they don't explode and basically just wipe us. That's probably the biggest thing on this encounter, is making sure that you have like the right prio damage and the right prio focus. From a healing perspective, it's pretty easy, because there's going to be like the timers for when some of the curse of entropies are going out onto your party. Even though you don't know which 3 players are going to be targeted by those curses, it's very easy to just sit there, hit your Mind Blast, set up your Rift, hit a Radiance, follow it up with your Penance and a lot of Void Blast to make sure that it gets cleared before the next round of curses go out, or before the next AoE from the dragon boss is going to be happening. Same kind of principle is involved as the first boss in General Umbrus. It's just making sure everyone has some kind of defensive on hand to survive the big knockback AoE. At this key level, it's basically that you need to have something, but it doesn't need to be super insanely strong in order to survive. So just having Zephyr and like Fade and Protective Light as a Disc Priest is usually more than enough to make sure that you're going to be able to survive that incoming damage. And if I have some extra shields on people, I'll toss it out onto like the Evoker or onto the Shaman, for example, just to make sure that they're going to be a little bit safer. We do have a bad spawn of the spirits. This can happen whenever the tank is not fully in that corner that you're seeing Drogo walking into. And so to deal with that, we make sure we just cross the lines for those ads, cross them together so that we can AoE stun them, and melee can still get full uptime in killing off those spirits. Since we already cleared the major pull right after the third boss fight, we did that before the third boss, then it's really just corruptors we have to deal with going into the fourth boss's room. What we're doing is we're trying to make sure we're taking advantage of line of sight to avoid the corruptor's focused damage onto one target early on. You can do this by kind of just pulling the corruptor a little bit to the side, and then everybody can start using the wall really to line of sight any of the damage, or have it focus into targets that have easy resets, like the rogue, for example, with a low cooldown on cloak, easy access to things like Vanish. It can be a lot easier for them to get that cooldown back when you have to fire off against the double corruptor, rather than burning a big cooldown like pain suppression on a 3-minute timer. When we do end up getting to the double corruptors, that's when we send barrier, pain sups, rapture, lay on hands, every defensive possible, even have the evoker like pre-rescuing people to make sure we're going to survive all of that corruptor damage. A lot of times what I'm trying to do is just make sure that I'm sending off some big rift damage, and again, our usual kind of priority of hitting our squid, hitting our Mind Blast, hitting our Radiance, and pounding big damage to make sure we can have some kind of solid output to deal with it, although that alone on this key level is not going to be enough to save you. Keep in mind, Shadow Melds are also going to be nice if you're a Night Elf to stop that effect from happening. So when possible, we're trying to mix in having people using those immunities, especially for double adds that we're dealing with, focusing one of them down, and making sure when we use those defensives is usually after we get the trash debuff. By killing off the small minions, you start taking more shadow damage. That's the huge priority area that we need to make sure we have some kind of defenses to survive. It's totally fine to use every single cooldown in your arsenal to make sure that you survive those double corruptors and avoid the 15-second death penalty, because the last boss, if you actually have your squid, your mindbender, your void wraith as we love to call it, if you have that and you have your mind blast before the first AoE as the boss fight starts, you're pretty much going to be fine. You get so much output out of this combination. I was doing like 3.5 mil HPS off the pull with that, and basically that alone for cooldowns to make sure everybody survived, that if everybody is using all those cooldowns beforehand to avoid corruptor deaths, and people are going to be holding on to major personal defensives for the circular single target AoE damage that's happening during like the tentacle ring as it's closing in, you're going to have a much easier time on the encounter. So even if you're like pugging, for example, I would always recommend you tell the group, hey, try to use things like AMZ, Barrier, Zephyr, those party-wide cooldowns. You can use those on the void AoEs that are happening, but keep your personal defensives for if you are getting targeted by the circles as you're spreading out in that ring. The void AoE is also a great area to use the cancel aura for Entropic Rift if you also needed it, since it's only going to last a few seconds for that large AoE, and if you just get enough healing possible, even if you're running a little bit late, it should be more than enough to make sure everybody stays alive. If you want to play super insanely safe on a fight like this, especially if you don't think that people are going to use defensives, you could basically just always save your squid for every Void Surge AoE, and then just work on having your pain sups and like rapture shields for when you're dealing with the single target hits. This will allow you to make sure you have shields, pain sup, defensives for the abyssal corruptions, because those are areas where people can splash onto each other very easily in a pug group and make it a lot harder for you to deal with it. And so that's usually where we're really like relying on everyone to use those defensives. At around 150, I was actually able to get my squid back, but I ended up sending it a little bit too late. And as a result, I ended up going kind of like back to back with Radiances, maxing out my Harsh Discipline stacks, and then sending in a huge penance. In an ideal world, this is fine, but you may not be able to have as much output as you're getting yourself ready to heal the Abyssal Corruptions a little bit later. The absolute safest thing that you can do is just save your squid, save your rift every single time a void surge is going out, and then just send it. You might be in a situation where you have like low haste, and this is perfect for that. You just say, hey, if I get my squid back early, I'll just save it for this moment. But if you have really high haste, like 40% or so, and you're able to cast on the move pretty quickly or effectively, you know, kind of using penance to slide, cast as you can, you might be able to have your squid back for the Abyssal Corruption single target damage and the Void Surge AoE damage. Great if you can, but if not, just having the Rift on its own, having your Rapture and not burning all your shields instantly, but basically casting a couple shields with Rapture in advance of the Abyssal Corruption damage, like on yourself or somebody else who you know might be vulnerable or you know might stack onto somebody else. That's an easy way to make sure that you're prepared and you have a couple other juicy shields on the back end to make sure that you can sort of like react and respond if somebody's taking some unexpected damage. Last bonus note, you might have noticed throughout this run, I was running Spymaster's Web. I was only really popping it for a couple moments in this dungeon because there's a lot of like downtime to rebuild a lot of your stacks. And so whenever I go from like a difficult boss fight into a difficult healing pull, I don't really want to be dealing with that difficult trash pull with low stacks, low intellect. You're basically holding on to like 4,200 intellect at a really like critical moment in time. So there was a couple times where I was sending it when I knew there was going to be like low HPS required trash packs that would follow. That's usually what I would advise if you end up having the Spymasters at your disposal. But huge thank you guys for tuning into this one. Let me know if you have any other questions or things I could address for the future for other dungeons. Be sure to like and subscribe. Huge thank you to our patrons for making all this content possible, and I'll catch you all next time.